Hey folks, this is Mr. Mompin coming at you again here. We're continuing to take our look at topic 1.6, cultural interactions between Europeans, natives, and Africans. This is part 2, excuse me, of our video. And what I want to do for this portion is to begin to take a look at the European treatment of Native Americans. Now, we're going to do this in 2 parts because in this first unit, it really is heavily focused in on the impact of Spanish colonization of the New World. Now, we'll talk about some other aspects of Europeans that will eventually also play a role in colonizing the Western Hemisphere, such as the English and the French. But in this video, we're going to be taking a look at really the Spanish. So, regardless though, regardless though of whatever group that you are talking about, there are some commonalities that we can find before we get into specifics such as the Spanish. As you can see here, as we've said previously, there was a general sense that these European colonists, especially, early on with the Spanish, that they were by definition, the Europeans viewed themselves as superior to the natives that were already residing there. And the general belief was that since these natives are culturally inferior, religiously inferior, they do not value how to use land, they do not respect what is believed to be proper gender roles, etc., that these are basically, from the minds of especially the Spanish, that these are godless heathens that don't know any better, and they are to be great individuals that could be converted to Catholicism, land that could be exploited for farming, gold, whatever else, and could even conceivably be used as military allies in future conflicts with other European rivals at the time, mostly the French and the British. So with that being said, let's in this video take a specific look at the impact of Spanish treatment of Native Americans. And to put it very bluntly, the Spanish treatment of Native peoples was massively brutal, horrifically brutal. This is one of those times where you can certainly get away with using words like genocidal in terms of their impact, or from a Native perspective, apocalyptic in terms of the Spanish impact of what's going to be happening. To say that the natives were subjected to Spanish domination is certainly an understatement. Now, that being said, for the first few decades of Spanish colonization in the New World, there did not seem to be a whole lot of concern about, how these natives are being treated. The Crown didn't seem to care. The conquistador explorers that were setting up shop didn't seem to care. Religious leaders did not seem to care. The main goal was, basically expansion of wealth, expansion of political and military dominance, expansion of Catholicism. All those things were the priority. The treatment of the natives were not really a focus at all. But that will change a little bit because of the impact of this individual right here. Not that individual, this individual. This is Bartolome de Las Casas. And de Las Casas was a Spanish monk, priest rather, during the 16th century. And he is going to be significant in pointing out some of the harsh, cruel realities of what Spanish colonization is going to have on native peoples in the Western Hemisphere. And this is going to play a critical role in some of the decisions that the Spanish crown will be making. Now, to give us a sense of what is going to be the impact, this gives us an opportunity to focus in on primary source analysis. Once again, primary source analysis is going to be one of the major skills that you have to be able to master in this course. So, this is going to be an opportunity to do that by taking a look at one of de Las Casas's letters to the crown. Now, I know this looks a little sloppy here. This is a source from 1542, and I've copied this onto my OneNote. I do not currently have a stylus that is working properly on here, so I'm kind of using my finger for all of this. But that being said, whenever we're talking about analysis of primary sources, as hopefully by now we've already mentioned in class, there are, of course, what we call HIPP skills, HIPP. Anytime that you are looking at a primary source and are analyzing it, you want to be able to provide those four things that make up that acronym. The first one being, of course, historical context. And you can see here, I put HC with a question mark because the question then becomes is, all right, when we hear what Bartolome de Las Casas has to say, well, what is going on leading up to this that's going to make what he says significant and important? Well, you should know by this point that by 1542, the Spanish had, over the last 50 years, had engaged in a number of exploratory expeditions in the Western Hemisphere, and as a result have conquered large swaths of territory, have, basically taken over various precious metal reserves, gold, silver in the southern hemisphere, have created by this point in time encomiendas, large farming operations based on kind of like a feudal model going back to the Middle Ages in Europe. They have set up missions with a direct desire to convert the natives, etc., etc. So, you have to always understand, where and under what circumstances is this person saying something. Otherwise, it's just kind of out in a vacuum and it doesn't really have much significance. So always be mindful of historical context. Now, the other three items, I, that's intended audience, P, be it point of view, or P for purpose, those are the things you also always want to be looking at. Now, for many sources you'll see that we're going to look at, there's in many cases some background information that is put here. For example, in this source, you can see what's italicized right here is not the actual source, but provides you some of that critical background information that does answer some of these things. Now, in many of the sources that you'll get, especially ones that are going to be tied to, for example, document-based questions that you'll see on the AP test, etc., they're not going to just straight up give you this information per se. But, as we're practicing, you always want to be thinking about this, even though to some degree this stuff is kind of just dropped at your feet. So, for example, when we talk about intended audience, you can see here that it says here in the background that de las Casas is writing to the King of Spain. So this is important because, de las Casas is not just kind of writing this to a friend. He's going to the highest source in the Spanish world, other than maybe the Pope, the King of Spain. Now, that's going to be significant in terms of bringing us to the purpose. And as you can see here, you can see this, it says in the background that de las Casas is writing this letter for the hopes of trying to create laws that will prevent the brutal exploitation of Native Americans. Now, that being said, as you read this and having some background on de las Casas, you should probably would be able to know this by reading this source. And then lastly, of course, you want to be looking at point of view. And that, of course, deals with potential bias and credibility. What people say and why they say it is affected based on who they are. And who they are can affect the credibility of that source. As you can see here, it tells us that, de las Casas is a Spanish Dominican priest. What that means is that this is somebody that is a part of the religious order. This is somebody that's from the inside, part of a group who is primarily, to this point, focused in on converting the natives. So he is somebody that can speak with some degree of authority and credibility in terms of what is actually happening in the Western Hemisphere. That is important. Sources that do not have much credibility should not really be given much credence in terms of giving us a sense of what the historical times were like. So before we get into the actual source itself, we should know by this point those 4 HIPP skills. This is a time where the Spanish have already been dominating the region for a half a century. This is a Dominican priest, which has credibility in terms of knowledge of what's really happening in the Western Hemisphere, speaking to the King of Spain with the hopes of trying to protect the Native Americans that have been brutally exploited up to this point. Now, that being said, if this is what de las Casas is trying to do, if he's arguing that the Spanish have exploited the natives, well, you would want to think, okay, well, what's the proof of that? What support does De Las Casas have for making this assertion that the natives are exploited? Well, that's where you get into a lot of the stuff that I've highlighted here in yellow. Take a look at a number of these things that he uses as support for how the natives are exploited. He says here that these natives are the creation of God, innocently simple, altogether void and averse to all manner of craft, subtlety, and malice, and most obedient, loyal subjects to their native sovereigns, telling us that the natives are good people. In fact, he says here the natives are capable of morality or goodness and very apt to receive the principles of Catholic religion. In other words, these are not brutal, evil creatures. These are nice human beings that are positive and receptive to the faith, which is, of course, definitely a goal of Spain, a goal of the Catholic Church. So, as you can see here, this kind of sends a message to some degree. Part of what De Las Casas is saying is that what the Spanish government has been doing so far has actually been counterintuitive to one of the goals, which is converting the natives. He considers that these natives are innocent, like sheep, and he says that the Spaniards assaulted them like innocent sheep. The massacre of these wretches, meaning the natives, whom they have so inhumanely and barbarously butchered and harassed with several kinds of torments never before known or heard. In other words, these natives had just been brutalized, massacred by the Spanish. And he provides specific evidence of the results of this. He talks about the isle of Cuba is now uncultivated like a desert and entombed in its own ruins. The Isles of St. John and Jamaica, both large and fruitful places, are now unpeopled and desolate. The Lucayan Islands now laid waste and uninhabited. So areas that had been, nice and cultivatable are now just been destroyed because of the actions of the conquistadors. He talks about how 500,000 men dwelt in it. In other words, previous to the Spanish showing up, and now they're cut off, some by slaughter and others ravaged by force and violence, to work in the mines of Hispaniola. Hispaniola, of course, where is today Haiti and the Dominican Republic. In other words, those that have not been killed, they've now been forced into servitude, slavery. They have now been forced into a situation that's kind of depicted like this right here, that these are folks that have been beaten and brutalized and killed and forced now into just straight up slavery. He continues to go on. He says that we are certainly satisfied and assured that the Spaniards, by their barbarous and execrable actions, have absolutely depopulated 10 kingdoms of greater extent than all Spain. 1,000 miles which now lay waste and desolate and are absolutely ruined. So in other words, he's talking about just massive amounts of death and destruction associated with what's going on. 12 millions, computing men, women, and children, have undeservedly perished. He says that those that arrived at these islands from the remote parts of Spain and who pride themselves in the names of Christians steered two courses principally in order to the extirpation and exterminating of this people from the face of the earth. In other words, it seems to him that the goal of what these folks seem to be doing, these Spanish conquistadors, is to just wipe these people out. He says the ultimate end and scope that inside the Spanish endeavor, the exportation and desolation of people, was gold only. In other words, that it really wasn't so much as saving their souls. It wasn't so much the glory of Spain. It was their own greed. He says here, their own ambition and avarice, greed, all right? And ambition has created this problem. He says they have treated them as the most abject dung and filth of the earth. The above-mentioned number of people died without understanding the true faith or sacraments. In other words, they didn't even give these folks a chance to become proper Catholics and learn the various sacraments of the Catholic faith. The Spaniards never received any injury from the Indians, but that they were reverenced them as persons descended from heaven, until that they were compelled to take up arms, provoked thereunto by repeated injuries, violent torments, and unjust butcheries. In other words, these were innocent people, folks that are good people, that could have become good Catholics. They could have, been integrated properly, but in the name of greed and gold and personal ambition, they've wiped these people out, and those that have somehow survived have now become enslaved. So a pretty strong, statement by De Las Casas in terms of what's happening. And this will ultimately lead to some important changes that are going to be happening in the Spanish world. It will eventually lead to, hold on here, we will stop this here if I can find what's happening here. I will stop now.